Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Library of Australia. I'm Vicky Humphrey and I'm currently acting as the Assistant Director General of the Collection Branch at the Library. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people who are traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance tonight. The next thing I would like to do is just check that you all have your phones on silent, please. Each year, folk musicians, singers, dancers, poets and performance artists converge upon Canberra around Easter for the National Folk Festival. Tonight, we're going to bring you folklore and music outside of that festival environment, as we're joined here at the library by baroque violinist and music researcher Shane Lestideau, who is supported by Rachel Johnston, Claire Patty, Emily Rose Sokova, and Ben Dolman as the Evergreen Ensemble. Shane Lestideau is the 2019 National Folk Fellow, a prize jointly awarded by the National Library of Australia and the National Folk Festival. Shane is a violinist with a variety of research and performance experiences gathered over nearly every continent of the world. She specialises in baroque violin performance at the Conservatorium of Boulogne-Billancourt. Is that right?
Wait.
Thank you. In Paris, and holds a master's degree in music from the University of Melbourne. Shane's National Folk Fellowship project, the New Albion Music Project, grew from Shane wondering about what became of the 18th century Scottish music once it was transplanted to Australia, through bound music collections, practice books, and in the minds of Scottish convicts and free settlers. She dove into the extensive music collections of the library to unearth the wealth of Scottish material. Tonight, the Evergreen Ensemble will be drawing on this collection as they perform baroque and modern instruments for you all to enjoy. The results of Shane's National Folk Fellowship have been so well received that her recordings have been picked up by the ABC Classics and are now available as a CD titled 100 Days Away. Tonight, Shane will be reflecting on her National Folk Fellowship, accompanied by exceptional musical excerpts. There will be time for Shane to answer questions at the end of tonight's National Folk Festival lecture. For now, please join me in making welcome to the stage Shane and the Evergreen Ensemble.
beloved, farewell to you. Tears may dry and hearts recover when the pain of parting's over. But friend and lover, absent long and far from you. Here is I with you, weeping, sighing still, adieu.
Welcome to today's talk on New Albion Music Project, which, as Vicky was making you aware, came about through a desire to understand how much of Scotland's 18th and 19th century music arrived in Australia in manuscript and bound collection form. The passion that I have for this music came about through studying the baroque violin, which you've been listening to, which has its own performance style associated with playing that instrument. And having grown up playing Scottish music as well as classical and baroque, there was a point at which I realised that there was a baroque period in Scotland too, and that it had its own repertoire associated with it, which actually necessitated an understanding of Scottish folk fiddle tradition, as well as baroque violin playing. And once I started diving into this music, it wasn't long before I was wondering how I could bring some of the playing that I was doing in that style into an Australian context. So just to, if you're not familiar with the music of 18th century Scotland, let me just take you there for 1 second. So we have an image of Edinburgh in the 18th century. The peculiarity of the music of this period is that there was no Scottish royal court during the 18th century in the sense on Scottish turf. There was the royal family, but there had been the famous amalgamation of Scotland and England in 1707, and Edinburgh had become a far-flung northern province of the United Kingdom. And because of this, a lot of the Scottish nobility turned to national airs, what we now call Scottish folk music, to reinforce their sense of Scottish identity. And so what you had was a wonderful mix of often Italianate baroque music coming together with airs that had originally been intended for either for voice or for bagpipes, for folk fiddle style violin playing, and they were mixed together into an Edinburgh chamber style. Very often the programs were a mix of, you might have some Corelli, afterwards a bagpipe piece, then some Vivaldi, and then some Handel or Purcell. It was quite outward looking and cosmopolitan, but it also had a strong Scottish flavour to it. So what I was looking for when I came here during the fellowship were examples of Scottish music which were written for period instrument, so for baroque violin or classical violin using gut strings with either one of a baroque or a classical bow, slightly different to our modern violin bows, or for forte piano as opposed to pianoforte, harpsichord. And what I found was quite rich. It's not that there are hundreds of examples on the shelves here, but there are certainly enough for me to get excited about. So I guess I could group the findings into 4 main categories, the biggest of which is Scottish music, which was brought here, either 18th or 19th century Scottish music brought to Australia in the early colony and right up to the 20th century. We have Scottish music, which was written in Australia in the early colonial times. We had Scottish music published in Australia. There came a point that the publishing industry in Australia was had taken the role that London had been supplying a lot of the printed music for Australia up until around about the late 19th century. And we also had music that was composed in Australia in a manner which was an extension of what had happened in Scotland. People arrived in Australia and they continued that tradition, not necessarily in imitation of Scottish folk music, but taking it into an Australian context. So what we just heard in the opening suite was a piece called Spreading the Sea Wrack. It's a piece that was collected in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, and it speaks of taking the seaweed from the beach and spreading it on the fields as a way of fertilising the fields. And it was collected in Scotland but had been owned by a young harpist in South Australia. I couldn't help but notice that the island where it had been collected from wasn't that far from the island on which Lachlan Macquarie grew up. And it's a lovely example of often when we think of people like Macquarie, it's under the British flag and we don't sort of distinguish them as in their Scottish identities. Well, he grew up as a Gaelic speaker, and he may not have heard that song, but he would have heard other songs sung by locals on the Isle of Mull and Ulva. And we coupled it with a piece called Native Land Adieu. The words are written by Robbie Burns, who needs no introduction, and he set his words to a piece called St Kilda. Mental blank. Here it is. A St Kilda melody. I guess the other nice link being that St Kilda actually is a very far-flung island in the Hebrides, and a boat that was named after the island was moored off the shore not far from Melbourne, which became the St Kilda foreshore because of that boat that was moored there. Going back to our 4 categories of pieces that were found here in the National Library, the earliest example was this one. This came from a collection which is attached to the Government House in Sydney, around about 1819, 1820 is the estimation, and we've recorded this version of Auld Lang Syne just because it is that quintessential Scottish melody which has followed through from Scottish 18th century all the way through to today. You're probably getting ready to sing it in a couple of weeks' time. And given that this piece of music has been in Australia for so long, it probably has been associated with some of those roasting fires, sweating British officials at the end of the year who were carrying through the tradition, the Scottish tradition of singing Auld Lang Syne at the end of the year. If we jump forward from 1819 to 1919, we have in Sydney Robert Baillie, and he was a violinist who was about the 6th in line of a lineage of Scottish fiddlers. He brought with him a suitcase full of music which belonged to his grandfather, principally his grandfather. His name was Robert Baillie. The collection is called the Baillie Collection. It's upstairs and available for consultation. And it's full of the most incredible arrangements of Scottish music in a 19th century style. Here's an example which we're going to play for you now. So I think that the Robert Baillie that came to Sydney he was practicing his grandfather's music. There are examples of letters that he wrote to his grandfather in Scotland, exchanging tips on style. And the grandfather of the person that wrote this, he often appears in books on Scottish music. His name's Pate Baillie, so it's the grandfather's grandfather. And so you have a sense of what a wonderful lineage the Robert Baillie that arrived in Sydney in 1912 was bringing with him. So let's have a play through this now. This is a beautiful waltz, Our Friends O'er the Sea. We've arranged it for cello solo. The original version had timpani and clarinets, and it was all quite modern, but we're going to play it here for string trio and piano. So it doesn't actually sound typically Scottish, does it? It sounds more like a sweeping waltz of a 19th century ballroom, which is precisely what it was. But it's not because it doesn't have the emblematic aspects of a Scottish folk tune that it's not Scottish. He was criticised by his grandfather, though, for having put aside some of the old Strathspeys, jigs and reels, because he preferred the mazurkas and the polkas and the waltzes of his own period. This Robert Baillie, you can see his name up the top, it's said that he actually, his full-time career was as a blacksmith. Now, we're about to play you this piece here, and this was one of his standards. It's well used. I think it would have been one of his performance copies. It has fingerings and other little things that make it useful in performance, but it's a very spidery script, if you agree with me. It's fairly difficult to read. Ben has a very large copy to assist with. And so probably it would have been semi-memorised, if not memorised, and so this was just a memory aid. So how he managed to keep his blacksmith fingers in good enough shape to be able to play this, I'm not quite sure, but he managed it. We'll have to cut some of the pieces a little short to be able to give you as many extracts as we can. So that's his duet on Scottish airs. We'll put all of the pieces that we recorded, we'll give them to you all in one go. So this next one, it's called Gloomy Winter's Nu Awa, i.e. gloomy winter has now gone, and it's the time for springtime and flowers and falling in love with young women, which is the case in the text of this song. You may recognise it. It was used by Michael Nyman as the theme track of that beautiful film, The Piano, but he didn't make use of the lyrics, and they really are quite spectacular. We'll just give you the first verse.
Gloomy winter's new soft the westland breezes blow among the bergs of Stanley shore. The mavis sings for cheerio, sweet the crawflower's early bell decks Glendifer's dewy dale, bloomin' like your bonny cell, my Lestideau. Come, my lassie, let us stray o'er Glenkilloch's sunny brae, and blithely skiff thy golden day midst joys that never weary woe. Trees may bud and birds may sing, flowers may bloom and verdure spring, but joy to me they cannot bring unless we ye my dearie own.
It's a beautiful song, isn't it? It's gorgeous. So here we are in 2019. 1919, that's when we were talking about the Robert Baillie who brought these pieces of music to Australia. 100 years before that, we had the Auld Lang Syne. And 100 years before that, we're on the brink of composing the Beggar's opera in London. It was composed just a little before 1725, and it took London by storm. So we were at the height of Handel's Italian opera craze. Opera was the thing to go and see when you were somebody of note in London at the time, and the Beggar's opera poked fun at the Italian opera. So it was the first backlash against what had become really a craze of its time. It, for the most part, contained Scottish melodies and was a comic opera, which wasn't a familiar form of opera to London audiences. And it was just wildly successful and has continued to be successful periodically in the 300-year gap leading up to the present day. I found a version of one of the early editions of the Beggar's Opera in the collection of Eugene Goosens, who was an English conductor well known in Australia. Actually, I'll come back to that. This is what the manuscript or the score looked like. It had first been owned by a military officer called Frederick Haynes, who was also a conductor, who arrived in Sydney in 1911, so just a year before Robert Baillie, who liked to scribble on his scores, as you can see. Very well used, it's an interesting example of this coming together of Scottish music and Italianate harmonisation. So we'll play you now the overture from the opera, and we'll continue on with a set of two Scottish pieces which have been arranged in an Italianate manner, which come from other collections, not the Eugene Guzan's collection. One second. I was just going to bring your attention to a little slip of paper which was in with the that version of the Beggar's Opera. So it's a snippet from the Sydney Morning Herald in 1921. You get both sides of the paper. So on one side, it's talking about the fact that in the 1920s, somebody had the idea of reviving the Beggar's Opera in Hammersmith, I think the name of the village is, and it had again taken England by storm, and it had a wild success, and it's sort of saying at the end, and who will be the first to put on the Beggar's Opera in Australia? And as time has told, a couple of years later in Sydney was the first version of an Australian production of the Beggar's Opera. But it is also interesting to note what was on the other side of the article, which is, a rather interesting article about world population and the proportion of white and black, black and yellow people in our population. Given that it's only 100 years ago, it's quite an eye-opener. Anyway, over to the Beggar's Opera. Let's go. hopefully you can hear both the baroque and the folk coming into the interpretation of those last two tunes. So it's what I love the most about the 18th century Scottish repertoire. You're on a baroque instrument, but you get to play like you're playing for dancers. We'll have to move along quite sprightly now because, as predicted, I am running quite late. In the second category of tunes were some which were written in Australia, and that always makes us so excited because, I don't know, we can claim them as our own perhaps. You probably have already heard about the collection that was found down in Tasmania by Alexander Lang. He was a convict turned a constable, and he wrote a collection of music over quite a long period of time. We're talking about the 1863 is the date that I've retained for this collection, and it's a mix of Scottish, what we would call folk tunes, and pieces of music written for dance, songs, probably what was for him a practice book, but also pieces which could have been played in a variety of musical settings, some of them informal, but others quite formal. A waltz, for example, can be made into the accompaniment of a very special occasion. We took one of his waltzes. It's called Anne Crocker's Waltz, and I'll just ask Emily Rose to help out with a demonstration of how it was arranged. So this is the original. So that's half the tune. It's a lovely little ditty that played like that. I think it sounds like it should be on Play School. But sometimes when you see the tunes in the collection, a lot of people don't quite know what to do with them. There are a lot of 8-bar or 16-bar tunes, and how do you actually turn that into a whole concert worth of music? So the answer is to make sets or suites of tunes and also to arrange them. And Alexander Lang, like anyone that came from a tune tradition, would have been playing and arranging the music in a taste which suited his modern sensibilities. And so we arranged the waltz in this manner. So we brought it into the minor and added some lovely harp accompaniment as well. We have a tune set of his. Let me just see how we're going to have to power through the tune set and just Okay, once through the tunes. Okay, here it is. We've got 2 strathspeys and a reel. The second is one of my favourite strathspeys on earth. I don't think I have a... Yes. So Lang gave his own titles to a lot of tunes that he'd actually brought out in his head from Scotland. He wasn't a convict carrying a manuscript with him when he arrived. He had them tucked away in his memory banks. The original title of this piece is The Marquess of Huntly's Strathspey. You may have heard Chris Duncan's recording, but here he's called it Major Lang of Burnside. great tunes. Amongst the music that was published in Australia, we decided not to record some of these pieces, but I just wanted to give you a couple of images on by way of slides. There came a point after which Australia was publishing a lot of its own music, and a lot of the collections that people chose to have in their homes were huge fat books that had all of the greatest hits sort of since 200 years past. They looked like this. They're not in any... Oh, there was the Lang. That's what the Lang manuscript looks like. So they looked like this. So a treasury, an Australian home circle. This one was owned by an Anne Baillie. I don't think any relation to the Robert Baillie in Sydney. And I just took a couple of examples of the Scottish tunes that found their way into these collections that had stayed popular, since the 18th century, when they were published for the first time in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Here are Songs of Scotland, Ye Banks and Braes. Within a Mile of Edinburgh Town, which was one of the pieces that made its way into the violin duo that we were playing. Auld Lang Syne. So that one's... There were many examples, many editions of the Globe Song Folio, and they all contain Scottish music. I don't think I found one of these compilation books that people had at home that didn't have at least a smattering of Scottish rep. We also have, in the fourth category, the music written in Australia, which is inspired by the Scottish tradition. I was so taken with this book, which was one of the first examples of music written in Australia and published in Australia. It dates to 1857, and it has a lot of mostly piano music. I'm going to ask Emily Rose to perform for you this piece here, or an extract of the Picnic Polka, written by Henry Marsh, and it is the continuation of the Strasbays and reels that ended up as polkas and waltzes and mazurkas, and became this piano repertoire which could be danced to, but was most often heard in salons, respectable salons in Sydney, for example. So all of the pieces that you've heard today came about through the fellowship research, but were recorded onto, not this one, this is an image of the front cover, so onto an album which has a number of pieces not heard today. Some of them are arranged, so it's an artistic vision of what was found here in the National Library collections. It, as Vicky was saying, ended up being picked up by ABC Classics, and through a strange set of circumstances was followed only a few months later by a second recording of very similar repertoire, this time from the collections of Sydney Living Museums and the State Library of New South Wales. So we have two beautiful brand new discs, thanks to the ABC, that are hot off the press. And if you'd like a copy, or if you'd like to know more about them, please come and ask.
I just add that this wonderful painting was painted by Shane herself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
and I haven't told anyone this, but if you look close enough onto the piece of manuscript that she's holding, you actually get the score to the piece that we are hoping to conclude today's concert with. It's a little added secret. But in conclusion, one of the greatest things to have come from this research is actually not musical at all. I found that by using the lens of using music history as a lens in which to look back in time and have a different understanding of Australia and my own place in Australia and our all of society's place, I've come to a very different understanding of what Australia is and where we've come from, and it's thanks to just looking at the music and who was playing it and why they were playing it that way. It's been the greatest surprise, because I went out in search of, Scottish baroque music in Australia, and actually on many occasions found aspects of my own personal history here in Australia. I find that, to be able to take steps forward artistically or on a cultural level, it's very important to understand the place from which we've come. And for many of us, given the huge population of Scots or Scots descendants in Australia, this is where we've come from. This is why some of the musical moments at home, why they've sounded the way that they've sounded, because of all of this repertoire that has come through into Australia over the last 2 or 2.5 centuries. I'd like to thank the National Library. That is one thing that I mustn't forget to do today, because this has been such a life-changing journey, to the point that it's now become my PhD this year, and which of course is going to be my next 5 years. And it's all thanks to this fellowship. So thank you very much to all of the staff of the National Library involved in making the decision to have me come this year as the Folk Fellow. I know that there are questions, and I would dearly love to answer them. Perhaps my question is, would you like to hear a last piece and then ask questions, or would you like to just ask questions? A piece and then questions. Okay, and I won't be offended if anyone has to go. We're coming up to 7 o'clock. So this last one, here it is here. Couldn't go past a piece called The Death of Captain Cook. As I was doing the research, there was that fantastic exhibition upstairs, Cook in the Pacific, which was so eye-opening. When he died, his death sent shockwaves through Europe, and a lot of people wrote music in his honour. One of them was a young Scotswoman, Miss Johnston. I don't think it's any relative of yours, Rachel. Perhaps, I never know. And Robbie Burns set her tune to... He set his own words to her tune. It's, again, a very beautiful song, Thou Lingering Star, and we'll round it off with another strathspey, which is a Scottish dance. I heard someone say, what's a strathspey? And it's written by not the Robert Baillie that came to Australia in 1912, but his grandfather's grandfather. So nice way to round off. Thank you very much for coming today.
To it was our
Shane and the Evergreen Ensemble, that was absolutely delightful. I have to say that it was the perfect way to end my day, and I'm sure you all feel the same. Look, we did promise you question time, so I'm going to say 2 questions, if we may. But before that, I just really want to say this is such a fantastic example of how the fellowship program can really bring the library's collections to life. I mean, just, a live performance based on the collections. But I think Shane very eloquently talked about another aspect of the library, and the fact that the library can connect us with our past. It's about who we are in the present, but it's actually taking us into the future too, that sort of continuity through the collections. And I think that is just such a wonderful example of that tonight. Yeah. Now, if we have got any questions, please could you wait until a microphone comes to you, because we are recording. So any questions? There's one just up the back there.
Thank you for your lovely lecture and the beautiful music. A 2-part question. What are the characteristics of Scottish music with Australian characteristics, and what are the characteristics of Australian music with Scottish characteristics?
Okay, well, I think it's probably one answer kills 2 questions with 1 stone. I don't think that there are pieces which, when you hear them, you say that was composed in Australia because of the musical characteristics. That said, we have a lot of pieces which we identify with our Australian culture because they've become associated with particular geographical locations. And if I take the example of Scottish music, a lot of Scottish music comes actually from Ireland, or what I discovered looking at the 18th century repertoire, a lot of what Scottish fiddlers consider to be typical Scottish tunes actually are very much Italian influenced. So sometimes it's not so much the nature of the music itself, but how long it's lived in a particular place. And I think I'd be lying if I said that I knew what the characteristics of Australian music were. I certainly can't wrap it up into a one-line answer. I just know that there are some pieces that when they're played, I know that for me speaks of a place in Australia, and so for me that's enough to say that it's Australian. Some people will ask, well, you know, if Scottish music has lived on Australian soil for 2 or 2.5 centuries, can we call it Australian? Well, I think the answer lies in if somebody listens to it and for them it speaks of Australia, well, that's the answer. Yes, it is Australian at that point, but it may well have come from somewhere else, and when you really dig back in musical history, you realise that all music actually comes from somewhere else. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's all I've got.
Oh, there's one question here.
Thank you, Shane. Great concert and lots of lovely information and history. On the question of musical history, do you by any chance know the original title to the music of Moreton Bay and whether it's Scottish, Irish or...
No, I'd have to look it up. But someone's raising their hand, so maybe they know.
Can we just
the what of
the
Oak?
microphone, thanks?
It's an Irish tune and it's called Bull of Vogue.
You guys can go and talk about that later. Are there any more pressing questions, or you're welcome to come and have a chat?
Look, I think that's all we've got time for, and I know that many of you would really like to ask more questions. I have a few that I wouldn't mind asking as well, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I want you to join me in thanking again Shane, Rachel, Claire, Emily Rose and Ben for a wonderful performance. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming tonight. But at the end of our evening, I also want to announce the 2020 National Folk Fellow. And the 2020 National Folk Fellow is Luke Burns, and his project will focus on folk music and folklore of the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. Luke will look at in-depth investigation of traditional songs of that area, as well as contemporary fiddle tunes written by regional folk artists. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to attending that concert next year. Thank you very much, everyone.